Okay. Most people probably can handle an hour of lecturing, but I don't. I can't. I have to take it in little segments. So I thought I would do that with Richard Carrier's excellent lecture, Why the Gospels Are Myth. Very good lecture, almost an hour long. I thought I would just make some little videos with clips, featuring clips from that lecture for people who don't have a huge attention span. But yes, Richard Carrier does an excellent job of showing various reasons why he thinks the Gospels are myth. One of the reasons is they're excellent examples of apparently standard myth-building practices. And no, it wasn't just like a diary entry, apparently. There was a great deal of planning and putting together these Gospels. Yes, there's a formula. There's reasons for the formula. And that's as much as I'm going to say, because I am not a learned historian. No. But Richard Carrier is, and he can say it so much better. So, without further ado, here is yet another segment of his excellent lecture, Why the Gospels Are Myth.
Mythic structure, I call it the original Lord of the Rings, because the Gospels employ heavily this thing called ring structure. That's formal terms for it are chiasmus and inclusio. This kind of structure, you see it like on the right-hand side, the A, B, C, C, B, A, where you have this sort of onion-layered nesting of ideas that all relate to each other. And so this structure doesn't fit history. History doesn't proceed in this sort of organized way. And I'll show you some examples so you can see what I mean. This was only used in antiquity in real histories or biographies when they were non-chronological. For example, Suetonius writes a whole bunch of biographies, and all of them follow ring structure very faithfully. But his biographies aren't chronological. They start with a birth and end with a death, but everything in between is organized by theme, which makes it possible for him to create his chiasmus. Because history doesn't work out that way, so you have to do it non-chronologically. But the Gospels work chronologically, so you can immediately be suspicious when they start doing this. This is also, some biblical scholars literally call these Markan sandwiches. And to give you an example, there's a story where there's a dying 12-year-old girl. Jesus is told about this. And then he goes and heals this girl. But in between, this story is interrupted by another story of a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And so this is an inclusio, where we have the story starts one way, it gets interrupted by another story, and then the original story ends. And that's telling you that the two stories relate to each other. There's some meaning about that. This is not how history works. This is how literature works. This is how myth is written. Another example is that fig tree I was talking about. Jesus curses the fig tree. So we have the story of Jesus and the cursed fig tree. Then Jesus clears the temple, and then Jesus goes out and confirms that the fig tree is withered and gives a speech about it. So here we have the fig tree cursing story. Stuck in the middle of it is Jesus clearing the temple story. Now, we already know these stories are bogus, like I told you before. But the fact that they're nested like this, that they're turned into this chiasmus of inclusio, or Markan sandwich, as it were, tells you that there's some meaning to it. There's some reason. These stories are related. You're supposed to understand the connection. Now, the ultimate sandwiches are the ones where the beginning of a gospel matches the end. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Mark 1 matches Mark 15 to 16, and we're talking about Jesus and John the Baptist and the crucifixion and empty tomb story. And to give you an example of how these are paired up, this is in the Gospel of Mark. John is said to cry with a loud voice, same Greek. Jesus cries with a loud voice, nearly the same Greek. An allusion is made to Elijah in both accounts, and very prominent allusion is made to Elijah. The heavens are torn, using the same Greek word in the Baptist story, but in the crucifixion story, the temple curtain is torn, using the exact same Greek word. And in antiquity, the temple curtain involved, the one that would have been torn, was a symbol of the barrier between heaven and earth, and even had the heavens painted on it, we know from Josephus. So these are clearly designed to echo each other. The beginning is designed to match the end. In the beginning, we hear the Holy Spirit descends upon Jesus, literally the pneuma descended on him. And in the crucifixion story, the Holy Spirit departs from Jesus, literally he exhaled the pneuma. In the beginning, God calls Jesus his son. God calls down from heaven and says, "You are my son." In the end, a centurion, a Roman centurion and an official of Rome, calls Jesus God's son. That's not a coincidence. That's deliberate. That was put in there to mimic the beginning. This is how myth proceeds. This is not how history is written. Similarly, the beginning of the gospel is, "Behold, I send my messenger before you, the voice of one calling out in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord." The end of the gospel, the women who find the empty tomb are told by some young man there, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter that he goes before you into Galilee." But the women, they fled from the tomb and they said nothing to anyone. So what do we have here? We have a mirror image. We have the exact opposite. It's been transformed. John, a man, delivers the message fearlessly and loudly to everyone, preparing the path for the Lord. But the women fail to deliver the message they are given, and so do not prepare the path of the Lord because of fear, and instead are silent and tell no one. These are directly opposite of each other. And notice that this is actually how the gospel ends. The women run away and don't tell anyone. That's the weird ending to the gospel. And if you want to know why would the gospel end that way? Well, it's ending exactly opposite the way the gospel began. And similarly, in the beginning, Jesus comes from Galilee, and then enters the wilderness to battle Satan. At the end, Jesus goes to Galilee after having left the wilderness, in this case the land of the dead, having defeated Satan. Of course, that's not explicitly said, but you're supposed to understand that that's what has happened. So again, the beginning is a mirror image of the ending. That's deliberate. And that's how myth is written. This is another example by Norman Peterson, the trad exact cycles in Mark. This is a very elegant structure. This is in the section of Mark that goes from Mark 4 to Mark 8, where we have 3 cycles with the same phases and then 2 intervals. And if you look, they're all matching up. The exact same story is basically being told 3 times and interrupted by the exact same story being told 2 times. But they're not the exact same story. They're tweaked a little bit different. He's meeting different people, but there's a lot of similarities. Now the key thing here is in each phase occurs during the day, then the next phase occurs during the evening, then the next phase occurs the next day. So that's one complete day, the middle of one day to the middle of the next. Notice what we're talking about here. It's 3 cycles, 3 days. So this whole story from Mark 4 to Mark 8 takes place over 3 days. When you understand that and read the story, you'll be mind amazed that all of this stuff occurs in 3 days. It's rather convenient. That's an example of a historical improbability. Very coincidental. In each step 1, in the intervals, Jesus, in each case, he meets in a house with women and children are somehow involved in the story. Each step 2 features the disciples on the one hand and the authorities on the other. And each step 3 inverts the other. In the first one, his amazed family disbelieves in him. In the other, amazed foreigners believe in him, using some of the similar words. So clearly we're looking at messages here. There's symbolic reason for these interposition and mirroring of the different passages. Every single scene in this whole sequence contrasts human expectations with spiritual realities, and it contrasts the faith of outsiders versus the faithlessness of insiders, and using different examples of outsiders, family versus not family, Jews versus non-Jews, and so on. And all of this occurs in just 3 carefully choreographed days, with pretty much the same events occurring, very similar events occurring. So that's how myth is written. This is another example. This is the chiasmus. Here it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. Then backwards K, J, I, H, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. This is the entire Gospel of Matthew, from beginning to end, first verse to last. The entire Gospel is an elegant, extremely carefully crafted chiasmus. And I'm going to talk about a different one in a moment, but you can see here, for example, we have a genealogy, which is a summary of past times, matches up with a commission, which is a summary of future times. And that's the beginning and end. But let me show you an example of where this is going to work. Yay. So you notice here, layer H of the onion. It says John's ministry. So we look what's corresponding to it in layer H in the second half? John's death. That's not a coincidence. Matthew has deliberately placed it there. And if we keep going in the onion, we get a rejection of Jesus in the first half, a rejection of Jesus in the second half. We get secrets revealed through Jesus in the first half, secrets revealed through Jesus in the second half. We get attack of the Pharisees, matches up with condemnation of the Pharisees. Right in between, which is the center of the entire chiasmus, is Pharisees determined to kill God's servant. That's the central message of Matthew's gospel. But he does all kinds of things. For example, the baptism of Jesus. What pairs up with that in the chiasmic structure? The transfiguration of Jesus. And there are many verbal similarities between those two stories. And you can go through this whole thing item by item, and it really matches up. Now, this is a very carefully written, and I must emphasize written, myth. mean, this is a literary masterpiece, in effect. This is not some oral story that was passed down. And I'll give you another example of the beginning matching the end. You ever wonder about the story in Matthew, and it's only in Matthew, where it said that they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us, and yet that he's never called Emmanuel, and that's forgotten forever for the rest of the gospel. Well, one of the last words Jesus says in the gospel is, I am with you always. Hint, hint. So you get the point, right? And it's not explicitly said, I am God, and I'm with you always. Remember when they were going to call me Emmanuel? You know, he doesn't say that. It's just the way that Matthew structures his gospel is communicating that, and that's a mythic mode of communication. This is Matthew's crucifixion narrative. So there are many of these chiasmuses inside the whole chiasmus of the gospel. And Matthew does it again. It's an extremely elegant chiasmus of the crucifixion. So, for example, Judas exposed, right here, layer E. What does that line up with? Well, temple exposed. Well, that's interesting. Judas betrays Jesus. What does that line up with? Oh, Judas hangs himself. Well, that's a coincidence. And there are lots of these different things like this. Well, for example, there are preparations. Judas is enlisted and the Passover is prepared, lines up with results. Jesus' lordship is confirmed and the least are faithful. You look at all of these, they line up either as mirror images of each other or as commentaries on each other. And notice again, layer B, priest's plot, layer B, priest's plot again. Matthew went out of his way to invent a second plot to make it fit his structure. So this is myth.